In the medieval period, you generally had two options for travel, by water or by land. And by water, that's normally heavy goods, so things like stone, big barrels of wine, and that kind of thing. But what if the river doesn't go where you want to go? Well, then you have to walk or ride. Again, it subdivides into two categories, more or less. Most people were going to be walking on foot. A few people with enough money might have a horse. They might ride the horse, or they might walk with their goods carried on the back of their horse. Maybe they had pack ponies, or maybe they had carts and that kind of thing. But broadly speaking, the roads were where it was going to be if you wanted to go to places that weren't on the rivers. Probably one of the reasons why most big cities in Europe are based on rivers, because that's where you could get your heavy goods. But nonetheless, walking. Now, how far can you go on foot in one day? Well, basically, it depends entirely on the road conditions, the quality of your health, I suppose, the quality of the landscape as well. But broadly speaking, most people talk about 10 miles minimum sensible walking speed if you're just pottering along, don't have heavy loads perhaps, and just enjoying the travel. 20 miles if you're going a bit more briskly. So somewhere between 10 and 20 miles. A forced march can go much further than that. A forced march can probably go up to 30 to 35 miles in a day, but you're going to need to be young, fit, probably a soldier, because somebody's going to have to be hassling you to travel that far. And you're going to be quite tired at the end of it and footsore unless you're very, very fit and healthy. So on foot, you're probably best to think about 10 to 20 miles in a day. On horseback, estimates vary, and of course long distance riders can go many, many miles in a day. They can go 50 or 60 miles in a day, or even more sometimes. But I've experienced horse travel at a more sedate speed, and that usually gets you between 20 to 30 miles in a day, and you'll get to your destination much more comfortably than walking. As things started to urbanize around the 11th century, people started to charge tolls for crossing bridges. That was normally a penny per person. It was normally about a penny for a horse. It was normally a penny for a cow. It was less than a penny for a sheep. I think sheep, it varies. The data doesn't seem to be completely clear, but sheep were either half the price of a cow or a horse, or a quarter of the price of a cow or a horse. So somewhere around 25 to 50% of a penny. I presume you're going to have a flock with you of 10 and you have to pay that much. Merchants with carts that were laden down were charged substantially more as well. So they might be charged 12 pennies to enter into a city at the gate itself. And that would also depend on what they were carrying. So if they were carrying wine and spices, they'd have to pay quite a lot more. Silk as well was charged dramatically more than goods like linen or wool. So there was a definite policy of charging an appropriate amount of money for the goods that were coming into the town. Now, whether people actually declared those goods and how thorough the guards were at checking whether you were smuggling silk or spices, I don't really know. My guess is there were bribes taken sometimes to allow people to go through, but possibly not. Possibly everybody just, it was a cost of doing your job. You had to pass through and pay the taxes as you went. And I suppose it was for the greater good, in that the bridges were maintained and the roads were kept, not exactly in good condition, but in less bad condition. It meant there was some money to go towards that kind of thing. So travel was fairly expensive, depending on where you wanted to go. If you wanted to go to lots of different places and you wanted to go through those towns, you might be paying a bit of money to go into each place as you went through it. So chances are you wouldn't go into a town unless you needed to. Now, obviously, you might need to cross a bridge, so you'd have to pay the bridge toll. The Roman Empire built a substantial road network across the island of Britain, some of which was still in use in the medieval period. Others had been almost completely abandoned. The places that were in use, like Watling Street and the Fosse Way, actually went somewhere that medieval people wanted to go. So whilst the roads weren't maintained in the same way they would have been under the Roman occupation, they were still better than a lot of the other roads. Some Roman roads just didn't go where anybody wanted to actually travel, so they got abandoned and overgrown, and in some cases they got quarried away, because there's a phenomenon in the medieval period of medieval people just using old ruins as a resource, as a quarry. If you saw something that wasn't in use, didn't necessarily seem to belong to anybody, well, you take those Roman paving slabs and you use it to build your cow barn. So a lot of literal destruction of ancient ruins happened because people wanted to build farm buildings or houses, which I suppose you can't blame them necessarily, but it is a bit of a shame. A lot of roads, though, in the medieval period were roads of use. They were desire lines. Some of them were ancient. Some of them predated the Roman Empire entirely. Things like the Icknield Way and the various different green roads, which are prehistoric and were still in use in the medieval period, of course. Now, these are little more than trackways, kind of worn into the ground by the passage of chariots, potentially, in the Iron Age, or most likely feet and hooves, mostly. And those were very variable in quality, as you can imagine, and varied vastly depending on the weather and the geography. There are places in the uplands which were fairly well drained, which would have been more or less navigable reasonably well in whatever the weather was and whatever season it was. Other places in the lowlands would have got very, very muddy indeed. And it's one of the reasons why a lot of travel was almost completely seasonal. You just didn't travel for pleasure anyway, or really for work, if you could avoid it in the winter. It was just dramatically harder. There were maintained roads in the medieval period. These were typically in towns and cities, and usually in the central areas where people had more footfall and where there was more money. There's a greater concentration of money, and sometimes local towns and local cities raised temporary taxes or temporary tolls called paviers, which would allow them to spend the money communally and pave the town square or pave the main street. This was designed to encourage commerce and tidy things up and bring a bit of civilization to the town. So the idea of your civic pride having a paved town square was very, very much a thing in the medieval period. And we have complaints about people saying we've paid too many tolls for the paving, and the paving's not been done very well. This is the other thing. The quality of the paving was quite variable, depending on who you actually got to do it and what systems were used. There were paviors guilds, but not everybody was a member of a paviors guild. You might just go for the cheapest option possible, and then you just slam the slabs down over the mud, and it wouldn't last very long. There were a handful of better quality roads in the medieval period. These were called the King's Highways, the King's Road. And from around the 12th century, they were required to be maintained by local people to a higher quality than ordinary everyday roads. They were specifically set out as needed for commerce and for infrastructure. They weren't necessarily that well maintained in all places, but they were strategic, much like the Roman roads before them. These were strategic, and there are some still in existence today. So, for example, the A1, the Great North Road, is a King's Highway back then, and still follows the same path more or less. And the road from London to Dover, very strategically important, was also a King's Highway. You were supposed to have more rights on those roads, and it was forbidden to block them or to put temporary tolls on them unless by order of the authorities correctly. And they had to be maintained for safety as well. The Statute of Winchester in 1285 specifically mentions clearing to one side or the other to prevent robbers and bad people from attacking travellers. So it must have happened, because you wouldn't put that in the law unless it was meaningful. The exact quote is, "Highways leading from one market town to another shall be enlarged, whereas woods, hedges, or dykes be, so that there be neither dyke, underwood, nor bush, whereby a man may lurk to do hurt near to the way, within 200 foot of the one side, and 200 foot on the other side." It's very specific, and 200 feet is a decent bow shot as well. But that's very specific. and arguably indicates that it was a threat from robbers lurking around in the bushes next to the road. And 200 feet is a decent bow shot as well, so you're going to see 200 feet that way, 200 feet that way. Fairly substantial amount of clearance that went on. I bet it wasn't always maintained that way though, but perhaps when the king was going to pass by, then they charged out there and cut the undergrowth down. So you've been travelling for a while, you marched the whole day with maybe a pack on your back, your goods. You need a place to stay overnight. Medieval people generally didn't do wild camping in the way that adventurers might do in fantasy campaigns, or in Lord of the Rings, the hobbits stayed over wrapped in blankets. That was rare. It must have happened, of course, but it was fairly rare. People typically went from one place to another and knew where they were going to stay. They'd have stayed in a local inn if they had money, or if they didn't have money, they'd stay somewhere else. Let's go inside and get out of the weather and explain. In the 12th century, people were beginning to travel a bit more. There was a bit more travel for pleasure. There was a lot more commerce. Towns and cities were expanding. Inns became a thing. Now, some of those were quite fancy and would cost you reasonable amounts of money. They weren't modest accommodations sometimes. But if you were traveling on business, that was part of the deal. If, however, you were traveling for pleasure, or you were on pilgrimage and you just didn't want to spend much money, camping wasn't really an option. I suppose it could be, but it was potentially a bit dangerous and not very comfortable. You could go to a religious institution. Monasteries, in particular, had an obligation to look after the poor. The weary traveller is part of it. They often had specific separate accommodation for travellers, especially on well-known pilgrimage routes. So on the way to Canterbury, for example, in England, or the Santiago de Compostela route. Those institutions were set up to cater for the traveller, normally on pilgrimage, but not always on pilgrimage. They often charged, well, they didn't really charge money. They accepted donations. If you wanted to stay there, they would give you modest food and drink, sometimes a small bit of beer and a small loaf of bread called the dole. In England anyway, being on the dole is to be unemployed. So, and that's come from that medieval practice of doling out charitable food and drink, and provide modest accommodation for visitors. A lot of these religious institutions had specific rules about how to look after the traveller. In the 13th century, specific hospices had started to develop, particularly in places like the Alps, where travel over the mountain ranges was dangerous. These specific hospices, or hospitiums, were managed by religious institutions. And also they started to develop almshouses as well, outside of the pilgrimage routes, specific places for people to receive charitable food and lodging sometimes. There's a 13th century set of rules called a customary from the Abbey of Cluny in France, and it instructs monks to greet guests with humility. And it specifically says, the prior or the monk assigned shall go out to meet the guests with all reverence, bowing and saying a prayer, for we do not know in what manner our Lord will visit us. I think that's quite interesting. They were reflecting hospitality as if Christ himself would turn up. I think that's rather lovely. Food was also described as it should be sufficient but modest, which I guess makes sense. You should not be hungry, but it's not going to be fancy pants food. It said, let the guest be served what is prepared without waste, but with ample charity, so that none should leave hungry or in want. That's quite sweet. But it also says, at the table, let nothing be spoken unless it be necessary, so that the mind be nourished by listening to the word of God, whilst the body is sustained by food. So they didn't really want idle chit-chat over dinner at all. They didn't want to disturb the sanctity of the monastery. But they also didn't have a vow of silence in this particular order, so they would speak where it was necessary. And I do wonder what kind of conversations would be had from pilgrims to monks. But it's wonderful. There is a 9th century manuscript that talks about the monk who speaks with a guest shall give him comfort and counsel as fits the journey ahead. But let him not speak idle words, for the monastery is a place of prayer. So obviously you could give advice, I presume. You could tell the traveller what was coming up and what might be dangerous, or what the weather was likely to be, or whether there'd been landslides or anything like that. But you weren't supposed to just chit-chat and jibber-jabber idly. So again, very strict rules to try to keep decorum in place and keep things sanctified. The other thing that's interesting is that decent behaviour was expected from guests. I guess this applies to hotels today and all sorts of places. You're expected to behave with a certain level of decorum. But it specifically writes this down, and it says, "Let the guest conduct himself in quietness with gratitude, that the peace of the brothers be not disturbed, and he shall retire to his room by dusk." So as lights out, as the sun goes down, you go to your room and you go to sleep. That was what was expected of guests visiting these particular institutions. And it says, when the guests depart the next day, presumably first light, I don't know, dawn makes sense. I suppose you want to make the best of your travelling the next day. You have specific instructions. Peter the Venerable, Abbot of Cluny, suggests that guests are waved goodbye effectively. We send each guest in peace with a prayer for safe travels and a gift if God has blessed us with abundance, for he leaves as our brother. That's rather sweet, isn't it? I think it shows that they were deliberately caring for their guests and trying to make the stay an example of holy charity and not turn it into a rowdy inn. So subtle difference there, not a subtle difference, an unsubtle difference between what might have been expected at an inn with drinking and carousing and music and going to stay at a monastery or equivalent. One was very sober and one was, I suppose it would depend on the clientele. Paperwork was actually a thing in the medieval times. Towards the end of the medieval period, there were so many pilgrims that they needed to start to have a little bit of paperwork. And these were often as simple as their name, where they were from, where they were going, the rough route they were supposed to take, and maybe the sort of signature of the local parish priest or bishop that had given them permission to go on pilgrimage. These were necessary because there were fake pilgrims. I'll get into that in a little bit. But passports as such, the way we understand them in the modern day, passports which would be issued were not specifically a thing in the same way they are today. You would have a passport if you were a member of the diplomatic kind of crew, if you like, travelling to, say, somebody from England wanted to visit the court of France. The court of France would give you safe passage, would give you paperwork that would say you were under their protection if you wanted to go. And these were the equivalent of diplomatic passports. So they did exist, but they were very high end. They were for extremely important travellers, not the ordinary person. Sometimes the actual paperwork that a pilgrim might need to keep with them would be stamped at certain places along the way, partly as proof of doing the pilgrimage, and partly, I suppose, as a sort of bit of a souvenir. I don't know whether you got to keep your travel papers when you got back or whether they had to be handed in somehow, but I like the idea of people collecting little stamps on the way to their final destination as proof that they'd actually done their devotional journey. Towards the end of the medieval period, there were so many pilgrims travelling hither and yon that big places started to actually have pilgrimage police. They actually had officials whose job was to check the credentials and paperwork of pilgrims. Now, one of the reasons people pretended to be pilgrims was they were potentially more protected in their travels. You don't want to attack religious people on their journey. You might get the wrath of God on you. They did get attacked, of course, and they often travelled in bands, but there's some principle there. Towards the end of the medieval period, there started to be pilgrimage police. There were so many people travelling on pilgrimage that they needed a system to check credentials and check people were genuine. One of the reasons for people pretending to be a pilgrim was that tolls were often reduced or non-existent. You didn't have to pay transport taxes. You weren't necessarily searched so much for customs. So smuggling, pretending to be a pilgrim and smuggling was probably a bit easier. And also you got free food and lodging if you knew where to go, or certainly very reduced food and lodging. So there was a temptation to pretend to be a pilgrim. And of course, if you were out on nefarious purposes, you could travel in a group of pilgrims and sort of hide in plain sight. Pilgrims often wore specific types of clothes, specific types of hats with pilgrimage badges, and they sort of had a way of looking, so people would generally recognize them as a separate group from an ordinary merchant, for example, merchant traveler, which meant it was quite a good disguise because people would assume pilgrims were not up to bad things. So if you could disguise yourself as a pilgrim, you could probably get away with an awful lot more. So pilgrimage police were a thing, especially places like Paris and I presume Rome. Some of the more major places needed to have security, but they also needed to have some kind of system to prevent abuse of the pilgrimage system. The other thing is customs. So if you were bringing back spices from your travels to Jerusalem, for example, which would be very tempting because they're very, very valuable. So a small sack of spice, if you could smuggle it home, you'd probably make a small fortune selling it. There were customs to pay along the way. And because pilgrims were not necessarily taxed in the same way and possibly not scrutinized in the same way, there's a temptation to disguise your smuggling as a pilgrim. And also there was a thing called pious smuggling. There's pious theft, but pious smuggling. So if you had been sold a fragment of the true cross, for example, you needed to pay tax on that when you brought it back home. But obviously, if you didn't tell anybody you were smuggling a piece of the true cross, you didn't pay tax on it. And so there was a temptation for people to not declare their souvenirs, their relics, as they traveled. And I don't know what that does to the morals of the situation. If you genuinely had a piece of the true cross and you didn't want to pay tax bringing it back from the Holy Land, where does that put you in terms of religious behavior? I'm not sure, but it's a really fascinating snapshot. People obviously didn't want to pay tax then. They don't want to pay tax today, but they were supposed to. And I guess many of them did, but I guess many of them didn't as well. So pilgrims traveling back from their pilgrimage, smuggling goods, was a thing that was done sufficiently for the authorities to take steps to prevent it. In summary then, medieval travel was very possible, but it was slow and deliberate. You needed to know what you were doing. Language was going to be a potential problem. There were actually guidebooks. There were guidebooks for merchants to look at the coinage they might use and what the value of each coin was relative to another coin. And I imagine there were very simple language guidebooks as well, how to ask for the local inn, how to ask for the local monastery, how to ask for help. We don't have many of those as a record, but there were definitely medieval guidebooks. And one is really interesting because this particular individual names certain places that he had a bad experience in, and certain specific people are called out as going to cheat you or sell you bad food. I think that's absolutely extraordinary representation of somebody's memory of a journey that was obviously important to them, but they got done over a little bit, and they wrote it down in the guidebook. There's a Codex Calixtinus, which was a 12th century guide to the Santiago de Compostela, that particular pilgrimage route. And it highlights places that are dangerous for pilgrims to travel through, so rush through or travel in a group. And it also suggests places to avoid because they will cheat you and serve you bad food. So the idea of a travel guide is certainly medieval and probably goes back way beyond.